Hi friends. So the last time I spoke with you, I talked to you about the difference between discrimination and prejudice and how we can fall into one of those four quadrants: the active bigot, the timid bigot, the fair weather liberal, or the all weather liberal. So then the big question becomes, what exactly is the source of discrimination and prejudice? And there are quite a few explanations that have been offered. Usually they come back to psychological, sociological, or economic reasons in nature. So one of the first reasons given for why we have discrimination and prejudice is stereotyping. So stereotyping occurs whenever we label a group of people based on some type of distorted, exaggerated, or oversimplified image, and then we apply that to all members of the group. Usually stereotypes are negative. Even things that are considered to be positive can be negative when applied. So say, for example, we walk in and we assume that people of certain groups of people are always going to be the most intelligent in the room. Well, intelligence is distributed evenly, on a normal curve throughout the world. There are just as many super intelligent people in Sweden as there are in France, as there are in the United States, as there are in China, as there are in Zimbabwe. So if you are someone who's expected to always be the smartest person in the room and you're not, that can be really damaging to your self-esteem. Anyway, I digress. So stereotypes are in all cities, or in all societies. Some typical ones that we can have here in the United States that we believe that all blondes are dumb. Someone who's a math or computer whiz can't also be socially capable at the same time. The drunk Irishman, the Russian who always drinks vodka, things like that. It's really hard to get rid of a stereotype once they take root, because even when we meet someone who doesn't fall into that stereotype, rather than reevaluating our stereotype, we say, well, that person must be the exception to the rule, rather than maybe my stereotype is wrong. And these negative stereotypes can then be used to justify unethical behavior. So for example, American Indians were seen as being savages, so it was okay to take land from them. It was okay to physically harm them. Stereotypes can and do change over time. The second source of prejudice and discrimination is scapegoating. So scapegoating is the practice of blaming your trouble on an innocent individual or an innocent group. This is a psychological and economic reason that usually stems from both frustration and anger. Generally speaking, minority groups are the target of scapegoating because they lack power. They can't do anything to change that point of view. What scapegoating does is it makes the powerless members of the dominant group feel superior. None of us want to feel like we're the lowest person on the totem pole. Everyone wants to feel like they are doing better than someone else. Minority groups are also easily recognizable and unlikely to fight back due to their lack of power. So some examples of scapegoating, and again, we see scapegoating happen more frequently during times of economic distress. So like immigrant workers. Immigrant workers have been coming here to the United States all along. During the 1990s and early 2000s when the economy was booming, no one cared. No one paid attention to it. So now, though, that the economy is going into a bit of a recession, or when the economy is in a bit of a recession, we start talking about all the illegal immigrants and how they're taking jobs from the United States workers. Let's be clear, most of those jobs aren't exactly high-paying jobs that have, tremendous benefits. They aren't the types of jobs that most people want to begin with. Another example would be the treatment of the Jewish population in Germany prior to World War II. Germany was in financial ruin at that point in time. One thing we learned after World War I is when you punish a country severely and you give them nothing left to lose, that just makes it possible for someone like Hitler to come into power. So the Jewish population, which only made up 1% of Germany's entire population, was blamed for everyone else's financial ruin. There's no way that 1% of the population can account for an entire country's financial ruin, but they were easily identifiable, and the stereotypes that had been put in place about, the Jewish people being greedy and hoarding money and things like that made it so much easier down the line for them to be placed into things like death camps and concentration camps. The third reason for prejudice and discrimination is the social environment. When we have close interaction with people who are different from us on a basis of relative equality, and that's key here, we have less prejudice and discrimination because we start to see the individual for who they are. And if we are around enough people who don't fall into that stereotypical category that we have in our mind, rather than starting to see people as being the exception to the rule, we will over time start to question our own stereotypes. If, however, there's intense competition for scarce resources, or if that close interaction is not on the basis of relative equality, we will see an increase in prejudice and discrimination. So, why do we care? We care because we have seen a significant increase in hate crimes. There was no formal data collected until 1990 when it comes to hate crimes. So hate crimes have always existed, but we haven't known the exact numbers until about 1990. In 2010, there were over 6,600 hate crimes that took place in the United States. So what is a hate crime? It is a criminal act that's motivated by extreme prejudice. The first federal anti-hate crime law was actually passed back in 1969. The aim for that law was to protect people who were intimidated or victimized while trying to exercise their civil rights. So that only applied to a crime that took place while someone was trying to engage in civil rights, like voting. It wasn't until significantly later, in fact 2009, where we saw this hate crime expand to crimes that happened because someone was motivated by race, religion, or sexual orientation. And that came as a result of two separate instances that happened relatively close together. And that is the attack on James Byrd in Texas and the attack on Matthew Shepard. So James Byrd, so the first of these incidences occurred on June 7th of 1998, when 49-year-old James Byrd was walking home from his parents' house in the early morning. He was African American, and he accepted a ride from three allegedly drunk white men. Those men told Byrd to get into the bed of their pickup truck, but instead of taking him home, they drove him to a desolate area east of town, beat him severely, chained him to the back of the truck by his ankles, and dragged him for more than 3 miles along an asphalt road. Byrd, who remained conscious throughout the dragging and even managed to keep his head up for a while during the incident, was killed when his right arm and head were severed after hitting the edge of a sewage drain culvert. His headless torso was dumped off the road in Jasper, Texas. When this made the national news, people were absolutely horrified. They couldn't believe that in, the late 1990s, people were still doing things like this simply because someone had a different skin color. Fast forward a couple months to October 6th of 1998, when Matthew Shepard, who was a homosexual college student, encountered two individuals at a local bar. The two individuals saw him as being an easy target and made plans to rob him. In the early hours of October 7th, the pair lured him away from the bar and drove him to a rural area where they tied him to a split-rail fence. They beat him severely with the butt end of a pistol and left him to die in the near-freezing temperatures. They thought that he was dead when they left. He was actually discovered 18 hours later by a bicyclist who initially mistook him as a scarecrow. He was still alive at that point, but was comatose, and he died 4 days later. Again, when the American public found out about this, horrified. Those two incidences back to back led to the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act in 2009, which protects victims regardless of what they were doing when they were attacked. 60% of all offenders are, in fact, white. Followed by about 20% are African American. The main reason for hate crimes are race. 50% or more of the hate crimes that take place in the United States are proven to be a result of race. About 20% religion, and about 20% for sexual orientation. Clearly, this is not something that we, want in our country that is built upon the idea that everyone is equal, that there is no difference between someone because of their gender, their ethnicity, their race, their religious orientation, their sexual orientation, etc. So the next time we get together, we'll talk about the theoretical perspectives on discrimination, exactly why we believe that discrimination occurs, and we'll also start taking a look at some of the different minority groups in the United States. Now, the data from the minority groups in the United States is as of the 2010 census. Since we're in a census year right now, some of the data that we have from that census is clearly going to be a little out of date, but it's the best that we have to work with for right now. I hope you all are being safe. I hope that you are all finding some type of way to enjoy yourselves during this time off, and you do not have any assignment for me this evening.